world is split up. It's been all over the planet, but we're only focusing on the Arctic database today. So Pete and I are going to just be pulling out some information and some analysis on just the Arctic. Looking specifically at the study area, this is the USA-Canada disputed maritime boundary in the Arctic. That's our area of interest. This is a 1 to 6 million scale. You'll see where the land terminus point is denoted by the land boundary as it merges into the sea in this polar stereographic slice. And the green arrow is the land terminus point. Just some background on data sets when we assembled the desktop study. All law of the sea projects on this planet begin with coastlines, so we used various data sources, predominantly World Vector Shoreline, World Vector Shoreline 2. It doesn't cover all the way up to 85 north. Coastline's territorial sea baseline model, and we're going to review that because they have some differences for use of straight and normal. Law of the sea legal limits. Obviously, the U.S. has something interesting with its own state limit, but other than that, the normal 12, 24, 200. The maritime boundaries, and there's a bunch of them that we're going to review. The land terminus point was quite interesting when we started the study, so we're going to look at that. And also just pick a little bit on some of the nautical charts, because a lot of our global work begins with charts. And you'll see that there's some discrepancies in the charts, and it needed some updates. So there was some interesting additional mapping that we did using some different analysis. Pete.
All right, so why the Arctic? Well, the Arctic contains over a fifth of the world's undiscovered recoverable oil and natural gas resources. It's the Middle East of the future, if you will. And of course, this is now up for grabs, if you will, because of the receding ice cap there. And we presented on this at the Arctic Technology Conference in Houston last year, and so that's the basis for our article, really. Now, the unresolved boundary in the Arctic waters of the Beaufort Sea concerns what has been described as a managed disagreement rather than a dispute. The controversy didn't materialize until the mid-1970s, and it sprang from the delineation by each country of the area it deemed to be within its 200 nautical mile zone, as well as, surprise, surprise, the granting of oil and gas concessions by each country, including in the area of overlapping claims. And the roots of the dispute or managed disagreement can be traced back to the 1825 Treaty of St. Petersburg between Russia and Great Britain. And that treaty provides for a borderline along the 141st meridian line. And this border was to extend, quote, as far as the frozen ocean, end quote, or in the French authoritative text, jusqu'à la mer glaciale. So it boils down to treaty interpretation. Canada wants the border to continue along the meridian line, but according to the U.S., the disputed treaty language means that the treaty border runs until the shoreline, but not beyond. And the U.S. favors delimiting the boundary based on the equidistance method, at least as concerns the maritime area extending to 200 nautical miles. As we show in the article, equidistance clearly does not favor the U.S. beyond 200 nautical miles. So that, in a nutshell, is the starting point for analyzing the disputed area.
Okay, just to give some background here. Here is a polar stereographic view. It's kind of interesting when we started doing our work knowing that Canada wants to use a meridian line and yet just swing to the east with Denmark. Back December 17th, 1973, they used the principles of strict equidistance line. And if you look at the U.S., who wants to use the principles of strict equidistance line with Canada, you go to the west, and with Russia, they follow a line of meridian. So it's kind of funny that on their other frontiers, they're using the opposite mathematics. But again, we're going to be analyzing this in that yellow zone, and we're going to be looking what the two governments have claimed and how there is some overlaps and where there's some problems. And I'm obviously quicker than my movie. Moving on. So here is the focal point or the study area. So first and foremost, this is a 1 to 3.75 million scale. You'll see the green star is the land terminus point, and we needed to go and analyze, map, and reinterpret all the USA normal baselines, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And Canada, you'll see, is using combinations of straight and normal baselines. There is the line from the land terminus going due north, 141, Canada's unilateral claim. There is a Gazette 1995 by the U.S. government for their strict equidistance line, which gives us the overlapping claims area that Pete mentioned, shaded in yellow. And it's about 25,000 square kilometers, a little bit more. You see the geodesy and the geodetics. And you also see that we take it out to the 200-mile EEZ that was computed from all the region's baselines. So the area of overlap is in yellow there. And again, that'll be the focal point. That's mainly where we're doing our analysis from. So, don't you love a movie? Okay, so here's a slide. This is the U.S. This is showing all their claimed blocks. The ones in green are issued to oil companies. The ones in red are sort of future concessions available. You see the U.S. was a bit over keen. They even issued blocks beyond the 200. Canada's only in this slide from NRCan showing all the issued green blocks. So those are all held present day by international oil companies. And you'll see the main takeaway on this slide is to show that each government has claimed or offered blocks up to their claimed unilateral lines. So the U.S. farthest to the east, and Canada has some in proximity to the land terminus point all the way to the west. So you can imagine that's going to give us the grief. So looking at that a little bit closer, here are the Canadian issued blocks. These are issued to super majors. So there's people like BP, and there's, well, various companies. I don't have all the list right in front of me, but you'll see there's 4 main blocks that are in contention because they've been offered and awarded to by the Canadian government, and you'll see that it goes all the way to the west, and of course that's encroaching where the U.S. believes that their boundary line is. So there's going to be a bit of an issue there. Pete.
All right, so it bears reminding that in terms of policy options, coastal states with overlapping claims to maritime areas have a basic choice between finding a bilateral solution or seeking third-party assistance. Same with Canada and the United States in the Beaufort Sea. Now, UNCLOS, to which Canada is a party but the US is not, calls for negotiation in good faith of what it calls provisional arrangements of a practical nature, pending final delimitation of an EEZ or continental shelf. And examples are the creation of a joint development zone where the disputing states agree to disagree on the boundary and proceed to joint development of an overlapping claim area, or international or cross-border unitization in cases where a discovery has been made. And these instruments enable the decoupling of questions of joint development from questions of sovereignty. There are very interesting and authoritative statements in the judgment that was rendered by the ITLOS Special Chamber in the case between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire that we refer to in our article. And we say that this could be a good starting point for Canada and the United States to consider negotiating in good faith a joint development arrangement. Now, disputing states can also seek to delimit the disputed boundary through negotiation or through non-binding mediation or conciliation by a third party, and we'll hear about conciliation from the next speaker. Interestingly, in the Arctic, there are negotiated or treaty boundaries in 9 cases, 6 of which involve Denmark. So President Trump, there may be merit in talking to the Danes, after all, maybe not about the purchase of Greenland, but about the Arctic practice in delimited treaty boundaries. Now, finally, the boundary dispute can be submitted to a third-party adjudicated solution, either through ad hoc arbitration or adjudication by a standing tribunal. We're not so sure that that will happen in this case because of the experience of the United States and Canada in the Gulf of Maine case 35 years ago, where, some of you know, the boundary position of both countries was rejected by the ICJ, and the ICJ imposed a 3-segment line. So, looking at the case law then that informs this maritime delimitation, simulation that we have done, a body of maritime delimitation case law or jurisprudence has developed through some 25 decisions rendered by various international courts and tribunals since 1969 with the North Sea Continental Shelf cases. There are some other cases, but that's really when the jurisprudence started in earnest. And through a technique of reverse engineering, and we can apply the lessons from the case law to this Beaufort see this, what is it called, manage disagreement, rather than a dispute, and make informed predictions regarding its outcome. And it's exactly what we have done. And our article is chock full of references to the leading case law. Now the ICJ, my former employer, is the undisputed frontrunner with 12 judgments. But ICJ boundary cases, on average, have taken 5 years and 9 months to conclude. The shortest, Gulf of Maine, taking 35 months, and the longest, 132 months. So imagine, you are a concessionaire or licensee, and you have to face that uncertainty for 132 months. ITLOS in Hamburg has adjudicated only one boundary case, namely between Bangladesh and Myanmar in 2012, but it did so in a record 27 months. And the ITLOS Special Chamber, in the case between Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire that I mentioned, took 33 months. The 4 UNCLOS Annex 7 cases took 43 months on average, the shortest taking only 26 months and the longest 60 months. So relatively quick compared to the ICJ. And the modern case law also comprises 7 pure ad hoc tribunal awards over a 40-year period. So there are options, but the countries would need to agree through a special agreement, which they did in the case of Gulf of Maine. Maybe that was why it was resolved by the ICJ, that is a chamber of it, in a record 35 months for the ICJ, that is. But it's anybody's guess as to whether we could see a reference by way of a special agreement by the United States and Canada of this managed disagreement. Maybe Gavin can shed some light on this, but we're not counting on it. And in the article we're saying that you don't need to go through this long waiting period to get a resolved boundary. There are multiple precedents in the region, but also through these 25 judgments that the countries can use to their advantage, and especially, as I mentioned, the joint development rules and principles that have been laid out by Ghana Cote d'Ivoire Chamber. So then, how is it done? And we really did a simulation, as Rob just showed with some of his slides. We have, I think, 8 figures in the article. How does an international court arrive at an adjudicated maritime boundary, if that's the way to go? What is the delimitation process? Certainty, equity, and stability are integral parts of this process. So that's what we're looking for. And these elements are reflected in the 3-step methodology developed by the case law. It's not to be found in any conventional law and treaty text, but it is now the accepted methodology that is applied by international courts and tribunals. And the court will start by determining what is called the relevant area. And it does so by identifying the geographical context of the delimitation, including relevant coasts, protrusions, and offshore features such as islands. And that's exactly what we did. In the article, we tried by approximation to identify the relevant area, such as would emerge from a court proceeding. And the next step, the court will establish a provisional line, typically, but not always, by drawing an equidistance line between adjacent coasts or a median line between opposite coasts. And we did that for this case because the coastlines didn't present any problems from our research, so it lends itself to a provisional line in the form of an equidistance line. The second stage, the court will consider whether there are factors calling for the adjustment or shifting of the provisional line in order to achieve an equitable result. And these factors are called relevant circumstances, and the case law clearly favors neutral factors of a geographical nature, such as a significant disparity in coastal length, over area-specific factors such as oil concessions and oil wells. And we were unable to identify any relevant circumstances, such as have been identified in the case law, that would actually call for a shifting or adjustment of a strict equidistance line in the case of Canada and the US in the Beaufort Sea. Finally, in the third stage, the court will verify that the unadjusted or adjusted provisional line does not, as it stands, lead to an inequitable result by reason of any market disproportion. And it's mainly between the ratio of the respective coastal lengths and the ratio between the relevant maritime areas of each state by reference to the provisional line. This is called a disproportionality test, and we were unable, again, to identify a ratio between length of coastal areas or of coastlines or of the relevant maritime areas that would dictate that the equitable result is not in the form of a strict equidistance, unmodified.
Okay, so let's get down to some basic mapping. This is a NOAA current publication, nautical chart. You'll see there that this is published chart 16061, January 1st, 2015, so you would think this is all current information. Sadly, if you read the fine print, the fringing barrier islands depicted on the chart were last mapped in 1955. So that's a bit of a problem, and that happens everywhere on this planet. Having done 1,800 projects now, I have not come to a country that I've not seen this as a problem. Looking in the upper right, something new technology that I have as part of our Law of the Sea package. I'll talk a bit more about it, but it's called Fugro 40 SSM. It's preliminary satellite imagery, and you see in this case that was from 2018 when Pete and I did that, so that's the now present day mapping. Taking the results in the bottom slide, you'll see it's draped over top of it, and you'll actually see the island is shifted by about 2,500 meters in this real-world example for Midway Islands, for Reindeer Island specifically. And the analysis has shown that Reindeer Island itself has grown by 369% over the 55 years that the mapping disparity is there. And this slide is a 1 to 20,000 scale image. So more a little bit about this satellite 40 SSM, because it's all through our paper. Of course, this slide deck only allows us to talk for about 23 minutes, or Clive will have our head. So a little bit, and I did decide to throw this in. So Fugro 4D SSM, it's something new I came up with about 5 years ago. It's kind of an interesting new tool in our toolbox, but it's nothing more than a preliminary shallow water site investigation tool. I've done it in every one of your countries sitting here. Every one of your baselines has been reviewed by a global project, and I've used images to go and QC all your baselines. So looking at this, here's an example. There is the Midway Islands, and you can see that I'm just mapping the coastlines of the islands. So we're only looking at the islands. Now take note, the U.S. government will use these coastlines for all their Law of the Sea, for the extended continental shelf, plus their offshore hydrocarbon industry. Here's the 2D to show you that there's some cloud cover there, but more importantly, here's the 3D of the image. And you can see the disparity from the original mapped island on the current published chart has grown by, in the west, over 1,045 meters. It is merged, and it is actually shifted to the south by 500. The interesting thing on this is the number 4, because this is how we've coined this. This is a dynamic where you can do analysis. 2 new scenes per month for 7 years, which means we can do time sequence. That's the component of the 4th dimension. And the only reason I'm showing you all these slides is these are just migration when the area is more or less ice-free, because this is the Arctic and it's up at 70, 71 degrees north. But every one of these slides, the only thing I'm wanting you to do is stare at the island. Don't worry about what's going on around the islands. So here's a really good one from July 30th, 2018, but it was 7 in the morning. I looked again and I found another satellite passing at 9 o'clock at night. That's the one that we used. This is 3-dimensional, so we're able to do profile analysis in the software to go and detect the edge of what is the fringe or the outer edge of the island. We've then remapped and reinterpreted the island, and we can do the direct comparison. Now the interesting thing is that's 63-year-old in this slide, versus now from today, 14 months old. It was actually only a week old when we did this work in 2018. And you also see that on the chart, they're talking about islands that were mapped in 1955 that don't even exist anymore. So that's another interesting hazard for people. When we started to look at the land terminus point, we also had some interesting results. By definition, the land terminus begins at the waterline. The Gazette of Canada in 1985 puts them 138.1 meters inside the U.S. to the west and inland. The U.S. puts their terminus point 3 meters to the west. So we basically rejected both of those, even though they're gazetted, and Pete and I came up with our own land terminus point based on the definition and where it should be. Second to that, we looked at relevant coastlines. The blue here is the relevant proportionality of coastline for the U.S. versus the 3 for Canada. We are in a sort of a confined area here. So there is 3 different frontiers of coastlines that are considered relevant for the Canadians. And you see again, it's combinations of straight and normal and all that, the blue lines, that's all our remapping using all those new images. But at the end of the day, this is our results. This is the boundary line that we came up with. We thought it was fun to roll it out to 400 miles because Canada and the U.S. both have lodged claims or will be lodging claims for the extended continental shelf here. So even though Canada might be unhappy with us within the EEZ, they're going to be the prize winners when you go beyond 200 miles because it actually swings back around in their favor. You see the construction lines, you see exactly which normal base points contributed to, and this line does not coincide with the unilateral line that was as claimed by the U.S. government in 1995. So this is basically a quick summary. And if you take this, and we're going to walk around the Arctic just to kind of have a peek, you'll see that the U.S. and the Russians have the treaty up in there. Then the Norwegians and the Russians have a treaty in place there. You have Denmark for Greenland and Norway on Svalbard on the north. You've got in the center, you've got, again, Denmark for Greenland versus Norway, and you've got Iceland for Denmark, Greenland in there. So these are already all in good standing. You'll see the one I mentioned earlier on, Canada, Denmark. They've got it right up until a little wonderful feature called Hans Island, and then from there and or north, it's still being discussed as we speak. So there's going to be some required work there. And actually in our analysis, the U.S. government with the last gazette of their point doesn't even go all the way up to the 200 because again, we redid all the 200s based on reviewing and redoing some of the straight baselines that are very bad in the Arctic for all that global analysis that we did. But again, it brings us all around to the yellow area, which was our focal point, which is what we just did and what our paper and our study comes back to with analysis. So that's basically a quick summary. This is a very quick walkthrough, but the oil impact is going to be an issue because the oil companies have purchased and spent good money on the blocks from Canada, and they're basically upset because they'd like to start exploiting or exploring. Thank you very much from me.
Thank you from me as well.